He was a millionaire in control of everything. Until, during a luxury dinner, a little girl appeared and said, "You are my dad." What happened next? Unbelievable. Hey, where are you watching us from today? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories. Richard Wells sat at his usual corner table in Le Jardin, an upscale French bistro nestled in the heart of Manhattan. The low hum of conversations, the clinking of fine crystal, and the soft strains of a jazz quartet formed the perfect backdrop for his meticulously ordered life. The maitre d' had greeted him by name, as always, guiding him to his preferred spot where he could observe the room without being observed. Richard liked control. He liked predictability. And in this moment, savoring the delicate flavors of seared duck breast paired with a 1996 Chateau Margaux, he felt both. The deal he'd closed earlier that day, a multi-million-dollar acquisition that would send his company's valuation soaring, was just another testament to his unparalleled ability to mold the world to his will. Alone, but content, he allowed himself a rare moment of relaxation, oblivious to the storm quietly brewing just beyond his polished veneer. He was halfway through his glass when he felt it, a presence at his side, small yet unervingly insistent. He glanced down, expecting perhaps a server or a misplaced child looking for their parent. But what he saw froze the polished image of his evening. A little girl, no older than 8, with eyes the exact shade of his own piercing blue, and golden hair that caught the restaurant's ambient light like strands of molten sunlight. She stared at him with a calmness that belied her age, her hands clasped behind her back as if rehearsing for this very moment. Before he could utter a word, she spoke, her voice clear, unwavering, and devastatingly precise. "You are my father." The world around Richard seemed to lurch, the background noise fading into a muted blur. For a man who thrived on logic and order, this was an anomaly he couldn't compute. His mind raced through possibilities: mistaken identity, an elaborate prank, maybe even some extortion scheme. He had always been careful. No attachments, no entanglements. His relationships were fleeting, transactional, and thoroughly vetted. But the child's eyes, his eyes, stared back at him with a familiarity that sent a shiver down his spine. Before he could summon a response, she reached into the small satchel slung over her shoulder and pulled out a crisp envelope, placing it gently on the table between them. With mechanical precision, Richard unfolded the paper inside, his eyes scanning the document. It was a paternity test. His name, Richard Jonathan Wells, was printed clearly, alongside a signature he couldn't deny was his own. And the results? Irrefutable. The girl standing before him was his biological daughter. He felt his heart pound in a way it hadn't since his first major deal. But this wasn't adrenaline from triumph. It was something foreign, unsettling. For the first time in years, Richard Wells was unprepared. He looked back at the girl, his mind now grappling with the implications. "What's your name?" he finally managed, his voice steadier than he felt. She tilted her head slightly, as if surprised he didn't already know. "Emily," she said simply, the name landing like a punch to his gut. The name felt distant yet intimate, like a melody half forgotten. His thoughts scrambled back through the years, to fleeting faces and brief encounters, trying to place the puzzle pieces together. And then he remembered Sarah, a whirlwind romance during a business trip to Chicago nearly a decade ago. She was vibrant, spontaneous, a stark contrast to his rigid world. They'd spent a few passionate weeks together before life pulled them in different directions. She never mentioned a child. "Where's your mother?" The question felt like an anchor, something tangible to hold on to amidst the chaos swirling in his head. Emily's expression didn't change, but her eyes dimmed slightly, a shadow passing over her youthful features. "She died 2 weeks ago," she replied, her voice soft but steady. The words hit him harder than he expected, a wave of unexpected grief mixing with guilt. Sarah was gone, and with her, any explanation or closure. All that remained was the little girl in front of him, his daughter, and a void filled with unanswered questions. Richard sat back in his chair, the weight of the revelation settling over him like a suffocating blanket. His carefully constructed world, built on precision and control, was unraveling at the seams. Emily stood quietly, waiting, as if understanding that this was more than just a simple introduction. It was the beginning of something neither of them could fully comprehend. For the first time in his life, Richard Wells faced a challenge he couldn't outmaneuver, a contract he hadn't anticipated. And as he looked into Emily's eyes, he realized this was one deal he couldn't walk away from. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and white as Richard's sleek black car sped through the streets of Manhattan. Emily sat beside him in the leather-upholstered back seat, her small hands folded neatly in her lap, the paternity document resting atop them like an undeniable truth. Richard's mind was a battlefield of conflicting thoughts, his usual clarity drowned beneath a wave of confusion. He stole glances at her reflection in the window, seeing hints of Sarah in the curve of her cheeks, the stubborn tilt of her chin. But it was those eyes, his eyes, that unsettled him the most. They mirrored something he couldn't explain, a connection he wasn't ready to accept. As the car glided into the underground parking of his luxury apartment building, Richard realized he hadn't uttered a word since they left the restaurant. Silence was his default, but this was different. He was avoiding the reality sitting beside him. Emily didn't seem fazed. She gazed out the window, her expression unreadable, as though accustomed to being alone with her thoughts. When the elevator doors opened to the penthouse suite, Richard led her inside, the vast space echoing with an emptiness that now felt oppressive. The modern decor, glass, steel, and pristine white surfaces, seemed sterile in her presence, a glaring contrast to the warmth she quietly radiated. "You can stay here tonight," Richard finally said, his voice carrying a stiffness he couldn't shake. "We'll figure things out in the morning." Emily nodded, stepping cautiously into the space as though unsure she belonged. Richard watched her take in the towering windows, the gleaming floors, the art pieces that screamed wealth but whispered nothing of home. He pointed to a guest bedroom down the hall, but Emily hesitated, her gaze drifting back to him. "Do you have any photos of her?" she asked softly. The question hit him like a sharp jab. Of course, he didn't. Richard didn't keep mementos of his fleeting relationships. His life was measured in contracts and quarterly reports, not memories. After showing her the room, Richard retreated to his study, pouring himself a glass of scotch to steady the tumult inside. He booted up his computer, driven by an uncharacteristic urge to dig into the past he had so neatly compartmentalized. He searched for Sarah Mitchell, finding her obituary in a small Chicago newspaper. The words were simple, factual, but the weight behind them was suffocating. She'd worked multiple jobs, raised Emily alone, and never mentioned his name. Why hadn't she told him? The realization gnawed at him. Had she thought he wouldn't care? That he wasn't the kind of man to step up? Sleep eluded him. Hours later, he found himself standing in the doorway of Emily's room, watching her sleep. Her small form curled under the blanket, her golden hair fanned across the pillow. She looked peaceful, untouched by the chaos she had unleashed in his world. But Richard felt something stir in his chest, a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. Responsibility? Guilt? Maybe both. For the first time, his empire felt insignificant compared to the fragile, breathing proof of his past lying in that bed. He closed the door quietly, retreating into the night, knowing that tomorrow would demand answers he didn't have. Morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across Richard's immaculate living room. The familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, but it brought no comfort. Richard sat at the kitchen island, staring at the untouched cup in front of him, his mind replaying the events of the night before like a film reel stuck on a loop. The silence was shattered by the soft patter of bare feet against the marble floor. Emily appeared in the doorway, wearing the same clothes from yesterday, her hair slightly tousled but her expression composed. "Good morning," she said, her voice tentative but polite. Richard nodded, unsure how to navigate this strange new dynamic. He gestured to the breakfast spread, toast, eggs, fresh fruit, prepared by his housekeeper, who had already been dismissed for the day. "Help yourself." Emily approached the table cautiously, her eyes scanning the opulent surroundings with quiet curiosity. She moved with a grace that felt too mature for her age, a product of having to grow up too quickly, Richard realized. As she ate, Richard decided it was time to confront the situation head-on. "Where have you been staying?" he asked, his tone more businesslike than he intended. Emily paused, setting down her fork. "With Mrs. Callahan, our neighbor. But she's old, and she said she couldn't take care of me for long." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that made Richard's chest tighten. A child shouldn't have to worry about where they'd sleep next. "Do you have any other family?" he pressed, hoping for a solution that didn't involve him. Emily shook her head. "Just you." The finality of her answer settled over him like a lead blanket. He wasn't just a temporary stopgap in her life. He was her only option. The thought both terrified and infuriated him. How had Sarah left him in the dark about something so monumental? But as he looked at Emily, he realized the anger wasn't entirely justified. It wasn't her fault. She was just a child, thrust into a world she didn't choose, much like he was being thrust into fatherhood he never wanted. Richard spent the day juggling phone calls and meetings from home, his usual precision faltering as his attention drifted to the quiet presence down the hall. Every time he passed by, he found Emily reading, drawing, or simply staring out the window, as if trying to make sense of this new environment. The sight unsettled him more than he cared to admit. By evening, it became clear this wasn't a temporary disruption. Emily wasn't going anywhere, and Richard had no idea how to handle that. When night fell and the city lights twinkled against the dark sky, Richard found himself standing outside Emily's room again. He knocked softly, feeling absurdly awkward. She looked up from a book, her eyes reflecting both curiosity and something else. Hope, maybe. "Do you need anything?" he asked, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. Emily shook her head but then hesitated. "Can I stay here? With you?" The question was innocent, but it cracked something inside Richard. He nodded, stepping aside to let her into his room. She climbed onto the edge of his massive bed, dwarfed by its size, and settled under the covers without another word. As Richard lay in the dark, listening to Emily's steady breathing beside him, he realized the full weight of his new reality. His carefully curated life was no longer just his own. The walls he'd built to keep emotions at bay were already beginning to crumble, and there was no turning back. The days following Emily's arrival unfolded like a surreal blur, each moment tugging at the edges of Richard's meticulously controlled life. His penthouse, once a sanctuary of order and silence, now hummed with the subtle presence of a child. Toys, books, and tiny shoes began to invade spaces once reserved for designer furniture and priceless art. Yet, Richard found himself unable to reclaim his old sense of detachment. Instead, he watched Emily navigate this strange new world with a quiet resilience that both impressed and unnerved him. She adapted quickly, her curiosity turning towards the city skyline visible from the expansive windows, her questions piercing through his defenses with an innocence that left him disarmed. One evening, after a long day of juggling board meetings and urgent emails, Richard found himself in the kitchen attempting something he'd never done before, cooking dinner. Emily had requested pancakes, and while Richard prided himself on mastering complex negotiations, flipping a pancake without it falling apart proved a humbling challenge. Emily sat at the island, her chin resting on her hands, watching him with a mixture of amusement and patience. "You're not very good at this," she remarked, her tone matter-of-fact but not unkind. Richard couldn't help but chuckle, the sound foreign yet oddly comforting. "I'm better at running companies than making pancakes," he replied, sliding a slightly burned one onto her plate. Emily giggled, a sound that filled the room with warmth, making the sterile space feel a little less empty. But beneath the growing bond, Richard's mind remained restless. He needed answers, about Sarah, about why she never told him, about the years he'd unknowingly missed. That evening, after Emily had gone to bed, he made some discreet calls, tapping into the resources that had built his empire. It didn't take long for his private investigator to unearth details about Sarah's life after Chicago. She had struggled, working multiple jobs to provide for Emily, moving from one modest apartment to another. But there was no indication she had ever tried to contact him. The more he learned, the deeper his guilt burrowed. Had he been so emotionally unavailable that Sarah believed he wouldn't care? The thought gnawed at him, turning his usual certainty into a gnawing self-doubt. The next morning, Richard found Emily sitting at the dining table, a drawing spread out before her. It was a simple sketch, stick figures of her and Sarah, holding hands beneath a bright sun. But what caught his eye was the addition of a third figure, taller, with blue eyes just like hers. It didn't take much to realize who it was meant to be. Richard felt a lump form in his throat, an unfamiliar emotion clawing at the walls he'd spent years fortifying. "Is that me?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Emily nodded without looking up. "I used to imagine what it'd be like if you were around," she said quietly. "Mom said you were busy with important things." The words hit him harder than any hostile takeover ever had. Important things. Richard wondered if anything he'd done in his career truly mattered compared to the little girl sitting in front of him. Later that day, as Richard stood in his office overlooking the city, his assistant, Claire, called to remind him about an international deal he'd been pursuing for years. It was the kind of opportunity that could elevate his company to global dominance. But for the first time, Richard hesitated. The idea of being away for months, leaving Emily behind, felt wrong in a way he couldn't fully articulate. As he stared at the towering skyline, the symbols of his success, Richard realized his priorities were shifting, and he wasn't sure he was ready for what that meant. Richard's sudden transformation didn't go unnoticed. His team, accustomed to his relentless pursuit of perfection and results, was bewildered by his newfound distractions. Meetings were rescheduled, business trips postponed, and his once unyielding focus wavered in ways that left his board members uneasy. Claire, his loyal assistant of nearly a decade, was the first to confront him. "Richard, is everything all right?" she asked one afternoon, her tone laced with concern rather than professional courtesy. Richard considered brushing her off, reverting to the aloofness that had always kept his personal life separate from his work. But something in her eyes, genuine worry, made him pause. "I have a daughter," he admitted, the words feeling strange yet liberating on his tongue. Claire blinked, processing the revelation, before a slow smile spread across her face. "Well, that explains the pancakes," she quipped, referencing the flour smudge he'd unknowingly brought to the office one morning. But beneath the humor, Richard sensed her approval. Claire had seen him at his best and worst, and her acceptance felt like a small victory in this uncharted territory. However, not everyone was as understanding. His business partner, Jonathan Pierce, was less forgiving. Over dinner at their usual upscale club, Jonathan didn't mince words. "You're risking everything we've built for, what? Some kid you didn't even know existed?" The disdain in his voice was palpable. Richard's jaw tightened, the familiar urge to assert dominance bubbling beneath the surface. But as he met Jonathan's gaze, he realized he no longer cared about winning every battle. "She's not some kid. She's my daughter," Richard replied evenly, his tone brooking no argument. The tension between them was a stark reminder that not all relationships could withstand the changes unfolding in his life. Back at home, Emily sensed the shifts in her father's world, though she didn't fully understand them. One evening, she approached him with a small, worn photo album Sarah had left behind. As they flipped through the pages together, Richard saw glimpses of a life he'd missed. Emily's first steps, birthday parties with makeshift decorations, school plays where Sarah had proudly scribbled notes in the margins. Each image was a dagger, a reminder of years lost to ambition and ignorance. But as Emily nestled closer, resting her head against his arm, Richard felt something else too, a chance to reclaim those moments, even if belatedly. Their bond deepened with each passing day, but so did Richard's internal conflict. The international deal loomed on the horizon, promising everything he'd ever worked for. Yet, every time he looked at Emily, the prospect of leaving her behind felt increasingly unbearable. He began to question not just his role as a father, but his very definition of success. Was it measured in dollars and accolades, or in the quiet, unspoken moments shared over burnt pancakes and bedtime stories? As Richard grappled with these questions, he found unexpected allies in places he hadn't anticipated. His housekeeper, Maria, who had worked for him for years without more than polite small talk, began offering gentle advice on parenting. Even the doorman, Mr. Grady, shared stories of raising his own children, his eyes crinkling with fond memories. These connections, once peripheral to Richard's life, now formed a support network he hadn't realized he needed. But the biggest shift came from within. Richard began to see his world not through the lens of quarterly profits, but through Emily's eyes. The city's towering skyscrapers became less about power and more about the adventures they could share. The minimalist penthouse transformed into a home filled with laughter, chaos, and love. And as Richard tucked Emily into bed each night, he realized that while his empire might have been built on strategy and control, his future would be shaped by something far more profound: family. As autumn settled over New York, casting golden hues over the city, Richard felt the weight of a decision pressing on him with increasing urgency. The international deal was approaching its final stages, the culmination of years of effort, yet he found himself dragging his feet. Every time he imagined boarding that plane, leaving Emily behind, a knot of guilt twisted tighter in his chest. He told himself it was temporary, that he could arrange the best care for her, but deep down, he knew it wasn't enough. Emily needed him, not as a provider, but as a father. One evening, as they shared dinner, this time with pancakes that were marginally less burnt, Emily looked up from her plate, her expression thoughtful. "Dad," she said, testing the word like it was a new language. It caught Richard off guard, but he didn't correct her. Instead, he felt a warmth bloom in his chest, unexpected and undeniable. "Tell me about Mom," he asked gently, realizing he knew so little about the woman who had shaped Emily's life. Emily's face lit up as she recounted stories of Sarah's kindness, her fierce determination, and the sacrifices she made to provide a good life for her daughter. Richard listened intently, piecing together the woman he'd once known with the mother Emily described. But then Emily mentioned something that made Richard's heart skip a beat. "Mom said you were busy with important things, but she always kept this," Emily said, pulling out a small, worn letter. Richard recognized his handwriting immediately. It was a letter he'd written to Sarah years ago, offering to meet again after their time in Chicago. But the letter had never been sent. Confused, Richard examined the envelope more closely. It had been addressed, stamped, but never mailed. A cold realization settled over him. Sarah hadn't hidden Emily from him out of malice or assumption. She had likely never received his attempt to reconnect. The truth unraveled like a thread pulled too hard. Miscommunications, mischances, and a life they could have shared, lost to circumstance. The discovery filled Richard with a complex blend of sorrow and relief. He hadn't been the absent father by choice, but by fate's cruel hand. This revelation shifted something fundamental within him. The guilt he'd carried began to transform into a fierce determination, not just to make up for lost time, but to be present, truly present, for Emily from now on. The following day, Richard made the decision that would redefine his life. He called Claire and instructed her to withdraw from the international deal. "Family comes first," he said simply, the words feeling like both a surrender and a victory. That evening, Richard and Emily decorated the penthouse for Halloween, their laughter echoing off the once sterile walls. As Emily placed a crooked paper ghost on the window, she turned to Richard with a bright smile. "This feels like home," she said. And for the first time in his life, Richard Wells, the man who had everything, realized he finally had something worth everything. The air in Manhattan grew crisp as November crept in, signaling the start of the holiday season. For Richard, however, time no longer revolved around fiscal quarters and acquisition deadlines. His days were now measured in school drop-offs, bedtime stories, and the quiet moments in between where he found himself truly living for the first time. Emily had seamlessly woven herself into the fabric of his existence, and though Richard tried to convince himself that this was a temporary arrangement, deep down he knew there was no turning back. The life he had meticulously constructed was now irreversibly intertwined with hers. One evening, as Richard reviewed some lingering business reports, Emily approached him with a hesitant expression. In her hands was a flyer from her school. "Father-daughter dance. Join us for a night of fun." Richard froze. The very idea of attending such an event felt foreign, almost absurd. He wasn't the type of man to dance, let alone in a gymnasium decorated with streamers and balloons. But as he looked into Emily's hopeful eyes, he felt the walls of his old life crumble a little more. "Do you want me to go with you?" he asked carefully, already knowing the answer. Emily nodded enthusiastically, her face lighting up in a way that made Richard's heart ache with both joy and regret for all the missed years. The night of the dance arrived faster than Richard anticipated. He stood in front of the mirror, adjusting a tie he hadn't worn for anything other than board meetings, feeling absurdly nervous. Emily appeared in the doorway, wearing a simple blue dress that matched her eyes, her hair neatly brushed but still slightly wild in a way that reminded him of Sarah. "You look beautiful," Richard said, his voice softer than usual. Emily beamed, grabbing his hand with a confidence that surprised him. At the school, Richard felt out of place among the other fathers, many of whom exchanged knowing looks and casual banter. But as the music started and Emily pulled him onto the dance floor, all his discomfort melted away. They swayed awkwardly at first, but soon Richard found himself laughing, genuinely enjoying the simplicity of the moment. For the first time, he wasn't Richard Wells, the magnate. He was just a dad. As the evening wound down, Richard and Emily sat on the school steps, sharing a cup of hot chocolate. Emily leaned her head against his shoulder, and Richard felt a sense of peace he hadn't known he craved. "I'm glad you came," she whispered. Richard looked out over the city skyline in the distance, realizing that this was what mattered. Not the skyscrapers or the deals, but the small, fleeting moments that built a life. It was in that moment that Richard understood. There was no going back. His old life was gone, and in its place was something far richer, far more meaningful. But just as Richard settled into this new reality, an unexpected phone call shattered his fragile sense of peace. Jonathan Pierce, his business partner, had gone ahead with the international deal without Richard's approval, leveraging company assets in ways that put their entire empire at risk. The betrayal cut deep, not just because of the financial implications, but because Richard had considered Jonathan a friend. Now, faced with a potential collapse of the company he had built from the ground up, Richard was forced to confront the one thing he had been avoiding: whether he could truly balance his new life with the responsibilities of his old one. Late that night, after putting Emily to bed, Richard sat in his study, staring at the city that had once been his kingdom. The decisions he made in the next few days would shape not only his future but Emily's as well. The stakes were higher than they had ever been, and for the first time, Richard wasn't sure which path to take. The fallout from Jonathan's betrayal unfolded with brutal swiftness. Overnight, the media caught wind of the internal power struggle at Wells Enterprises. Headlines splashed across business journals, speculating on the company's stability and Richard's sudden withdrawal from the international deal. Investors panicked, stocks wavered, and Richard found himself at the center of a storm he hadn't seen coming. His phone rang incessantly, emails piled up, and his once loyal board members began to question his leadership. But through it all, Richard's thoughts remained anchored to Emily. Balancing crisis management with parenthood proved more challenging than Richard anticipated. Emily noticed the change almost immediately. The late-night phone calls, the tense expressions, the hurried goodbyes before school, all reminders of the life Richard had tried to leave behind. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of damage control, Richard came home to find Emily waiting for him at the kitchen table, her backpack by her side. "Are you leaving?" she asked quietly, her eyes searching his face for an answer he wasn't sure he could give. The question stopped him in his tracks. "No," he replied, his voice firm but gentle. "I'm not going anywhere." But even as he said it, Richard felt the weight of his words pressing down on him. Could he truly protect both his company and his daughter? Desperate for clarity, Richard reached out to Claire, inviting her over for a rare personal conversation. They sat in his dimly lit study, the city lights casting long shadows across the room. "I don't know if I can do this," he confessed, the vulnerability in his voice a stark contrast to the confident man Claire had worked beside for years. Claire listened patiently before offering simple advice. "You've faced bigger challenges, Richard. The difference is, this time it matters." Her words lingered in the air, resonating deeper than any boardroom strategy session ever had. The next day, Richard made a decision that would change everything. He called an emergency board meeting, confronting Jonathan and the other members with irrefutable evidence of the reckless decisions that had jeopardized the company. Richard's speech was unlike any he'd given before. It wasn't just about profits and growth. It was about integrity, responsibility, and the kind of legacy he wanted to leave behind. "This company was built on my vision," he declared, his voice steady. "But if maintaining it means sacrificing the person I've become, then it's not worth saving." The board was stunned into silence, but Richard's conviction was unshakable. He proposed a radical restructuring, stepping down from the day-to-day operations to focus on his role as a father, while appointing a trusted team to oversee the company's future. It was a risky move, one that could either stabilize the company or hasten its decline. But for the first time, Richard didn't care about the outcome. He knew his priorities had shifted irrevocably. Returning home that evening, Richard found Emily in her room, working on a school project. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting up with a smile that erased the stress of the day. "Did you fix it?" she asked, referring to the company, though she didn't fully understand the complexities involved. Richard nodded, sitting beside her. "I did what needed to be done." And in that moment, he realized that sometimes the hardest decisions weren't about what you were willing to fight for, but what you were willing to let go of. Just as Richard began to find a semblance of balance between his new role as a father and the residual responsibilities of his company, an unexpected letter arrived in the mail. It was from Sarah's attorney, containing documents Sarah had prepared before her death, letters, journals, and, most surprisingly, a will that included a detailed account of her relationship with Richard. As Richard read through Sarah's words, he was transported back to their time together in Chicago, to moments he had long buried under layers of ambition and denial. Sarah's letters were filled with love, hope, and an underlying sadness. She wrote about their brief time together, how she had considered telling him about Emily but ultimately decided against it, believing he wouldn't want the responsibility. But as Richard read on, he discovered something that shook him to his core. Sarah had tried to contact him multiple times. She had written letters, left messages, even visited his office in New York, only to be turned away by his gatekeeping staff. Richard's heart sank as he realized the extent of his obliviousness. His empire, built on efficiency and control, had inadvertently erected walls that kept out the very people who mattered most. The revelation hit Richard like a freight train. All these years, he had convinced himself that his isolation was a choice, a necessity for success. But now he saw it for what it truly was, a self-imposed prison that had cost him more than he ever realized. The guilt was overwhelming, but alongside it came a fierce determination to honor Sarah's memory and make up for the lost time with Emily. That evening, Richard sat with Emily, sharing Sarah's letters and journals with her. Together, they pieced together the story of a woman who had loved them both fiercely, despite the circumstances. Emily listened intently, her eyes shining with tears as she learned more about her mother's strength and resilience. "She wanted us to be happy," Richard whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "And I promise, I'll do everything I can to make sure we are." In the days that followed, Richard took Emily to visit Chicago. They retraced Sarah's steps, visiting her favorite coffee shop, the park where she used to take Emily, and even the modest apartment where they had lived. It was a journey of healing for both of them, a chance to confront the ghosts of the past and build a future rooted in understanding and love. As they stood by Sarah's grave, Richard felt a sense of closure he hadn't thought possible. He placed a single white rose on the headstone, his heart filled with gratitude and regret in equal measure. Emily slipped her hand into his, and together they walked away, leaving behind the shadows of what could have been, ready to embrace what lay ahead. Winter descended on New York with its usual icy grip, coating the city in a thin layer of frost and slowing the frenetic pace of life. For Richard, however, there was no slowing down. Though he had stepped back from the day-to-day operations of Wells Enterprises, the ripple effects of his decisions were still unfolding. His bold restructuring of the company had stabilized the board for now, but the media continued to speculate on his leadership and personal life. Paparazzi occasionally lingered outside his building, eager to capture the elusive tycoon turned unexpected father. Yet, amidst the chaos, Richard felt a clarity he'd never known before. Emily was thriving in ways that filled Richard with a quiet pride. Her once cautious demeanor had blossomed into a confident, curious spirit. She brought life to the penthouse, filling its sterile halls with laughter, questions, and the kind of chaos Richard had once despised but now cherished. Yet, beneath the warmth of their growing bond, an unavoidable challenge loomed. The company was facing a critical juncture. A rival conglomerate, Helix International, had set its sights on acquiring Wells Enterprises. It was an aggressive move, exploiting the perceived instability within the company following Richard's withdrawal. The board was pressuring him to return full-time to fend off the takeover, but Richard knew that doing so would pull him away from Emily when she needed him most. One evening, after tucking Emily into bed, Richard sat in his study, staring at the acquisition proposal from Helix. The numbers were staggering. Accepting the offer would make him wealthier than he could have ever imagined, freeing him from the burden of corporate warfare. But it would also mean relinquishing the legacy he had built from the ground up. The decision weighed heavily on him, not just for its financial implications, but for what it represented. Was he ready to let go of the empire that had defined him for so long? Claire visited the next day, sensing his turmoil. They sat together over coffee, the city sprawling beneath them. "You've always been the man with the plan, Richard," Claire said softly. "But maybe it's time to ask yourself, what kind of legacy do you really want to leave?" Her words echoed in his mind long after she left. Legacy. It wasn't just about wealth or power anymore. It was about Emily. It was about the kind of father he wanted to be, the kind of example he wanted to set. That evening, Richard took Emily ice skating at Rockefeller Center. They wobbled and laughed on the ice, the towering Christmas tree casting colorful reflections on the rink. As they sat afterward, sipping hot chocolate and watching the skaters, Emily looked up at him with those piercing blue eyes. "Are you going to have to leave again?" she asked quietly. The question hit Richard harder than any business decision ever could. He shook his head, pulling her close. "I'm right where I need to be," he whispered. And in that moment, Richard made his decision. The following day, Richard called an emergency board meeting. Standing before the assembled executives, he addressed them with a confidence that had nothing to do with corporate strategy and everything to do with personal conviction. "I built this company from nothing," he began, his voice steady. "But I won't sacrifice my family to keep it." He outlined his plan to reject Helix's offer and transition Wells Enterprises into a new era, one that prioritized sustainability, ethical practices, and a leadership structure that didn't rely solely on him. It was a radical proposal, but Richard's passion was undeniable. By the end of the meeting, the board stood behind him, not just because of his vision, but because of the man he had become. The rejection of Helix's offer sent shockwaves through the business world. Media outlets speculated on Richard's mental state, questioning whether he was making decisions driven by personal circumstances rather than sound business judgment. Investors wavered, and stock prices fluctuated. But Richard stood firm, his resolve unshaken. He had faced countless boardroom battles, but this was different. This wasn't just about protecting a company. It was about protecting the life he had fought to build with Emily. Helix responded aggressively, launching a hostile takeover attempt that threatened to dismantle Wells Enterprises from within. The board was in chaos, and Richard was pulled back into the fray, navigating legal battles, negotiating with stakeholders, and rallying his loyal allies within the company. The pressure was immense, and for the first time since Emily had entered his life, Richard found himself struggling to maintain the delicate balance between his professional responsibilities and his role as a father. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of negotiations, Richard returned home to find Emily waiting for him with a worried expression. "You're different," she said quietly. "Like before." The words cut deep, a painful reminder of the man he used to be. Richard knelt before her, taking her small hands in his. "I'm still me," he promised. "But sometimes, to protect the things we love, we have to fight a little harder." Emily nodded, her understanding far beyond her years, but Richard could see the worry lingering in her eyes. As the final showdown with Helix approached, Richard knew he needed to make a decisive move. He gathered his most trusted advisors, including Claire, and outlined a bold strategy to not just defend the company, but to transform it into something stronger, more resilient. It involved taking significant risks, leveraging assets in ways that would either solidify their position or leave them vulnerable. But Richard wasn't afraid. For the first time, he understood that true strength came not from control, but from trust in himself, in his team, and in the new life he was building with Emily. The day of the final board meeting arrived, and Richard entered the room with a calm confidence. Helix's representatives sat across the table, their expressions smug, convinced they had already won. But Richard had one final card to play. He unveiled a strategic partnership with a coalition of ethical investors who shared his vision for the future of Wells Enterprises. The deal not only secured the company's independence, but also positioned it for unprecedented growth in the emerging markets of sustainable technology and innovation. As the meeting concluded and Helix's representatives left, defeated and humiliated, Richard felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had fought for his company, but more importantly, he had fought for his family. Returning home that evening, he found Emily waiting with a smile that lit up the room. "Did you win?" she asked. Richard scooped her into his arms, holding her close. "We did," he replied, knowing that the real victory wasn't in the boardroom but in the life they were building together. Spring arrived in New York, bringing with it a sense of renewal and hope. The city bloomed with life, and so did Richard and Emily's world. The battles had been fought, the decisions made, and now it was time to embrace the future. Wells Enterprises thrived under its new leadership structure, allowing Richard the freedom to focus on what truly mattered, being a father. Their days were filled with simple joys. Weekend trips to Central Park, pancake breakfasts that no longer resulted in burnt batter, and quiet evenings spent reading together. Richard discovered the small, everyday moments that made life meaningful. Emily flourished, her once guarded heart now open and filled with the love and security she had longed for. The penthouse, once a symbol of Richard's isolation, had transformed into a home brimming with warmth and laughter. One sunny afternoon, as they strolled through the park, Emily tugged at Richard's hand, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Can we get a dog?" she asked, her voice filled with the kind of hope only a child could possess. Richard chuckled, the idea of a dog in his pristine apartment once unthinkable, but now it felt like the perfect addition to their new life. "We'll think about it," he replied, his heart swelling with a love that no business deal could ever match. As they sat on a bench, watching the world go by, Emily leaned against Richard, her voice soft but certain. "I'm glad you're my dad." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything they had been through. Richard felt a lump form in his throat, the emotions of the past year washing over him. He wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. "I'm glad you're my daughter," he whispered, knowing that in finding Emily, he had discovered something far more valuable than any empire he could have built. In that moment, surrounded by the vibrant life of the city he once sought to conquer, Richard Wells realized he had found his true legacy, not in the towering skyscrapers or the millions in his bank account, but in the bond he shared with Emily. The man who had once controlled every aspect of his life had learned to let go, to embrace the unpredictable beauty of love and family. And as they walked home together, hand in hand, Richard knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. For the first time in his life, Richard Wells was truly home. Thank you for listening until the end. What did you think of this story? If you can, leave your feedback in the comments. It helps me improve and motivates me to keep sharing stories. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and activate the notification bell. I'm sure the next video that pops up on your screen will also touch your heart. A big kiss, and see you in the next story.